I thought I'd start with a question about the relationship between ideas and the world of affairs. You've devoted real time in your life to studying thinkers like Hobbes, Clausewitz, Marx, others. Why do these thinkers matter? How do these ideas matter? How are they relevant to those who want to think about the real strategic challenges that America faces and the world faces?
So I think there are a couple of reasons, and I've touched on these over the course of the past few days. One is because we need to understand how they influence other people, because these thinkers and the various ways in which they are interpreted and the ways that the interpretations interact really do shape the way other people think about the world. And so it's important to be able to recognize when you are dealing with someone who is clearly imagining himself or herself to be following in a particular framework, and to be able to recognize that framework. And sometimes it can give you a lot more insight into the rest of their thinking than you would have just based on your conversation. That can be misleading also, but it's helpful. But I think it's probably more important because it's an opportunity to require us to be self-reflective and to think hard about how we see the world, both in terms of these fundamental assumptions, but also in terms of how we actually process it and think about it. And I think that that is so critical, and it's just not something that people think about enough. No human being makes decisions on the basis of reality. Every human being makes decisions on the basis of his or her perception of reality. That's the way we're built. And if you don't understand the lens, the perceptual lens through which you are seeing the world, then you don't, and of course that's impossible to do that fully, but if you don't try, then you won't understand the biases in your own approach. And if you don't understand what different perceptual lenses are, then you'll be mirror imaging all the time, which is what we tend to do and which tends to lead to disaster. So I think both because they are objectively helpful because people think in these categories, but also as a way of reflecting on how we ourselves are dealing with the world, it's incredibly important.
So if you are, in government and you are staffing a security council or agency that had to deal with foreign affairs, why does it matter if those people have read Thucydides or Clausewitz or Machiavelli? And why does it matter for people that aspire to have careers in public life, who aspire to be experts who are dealing with real concrete challenges? Isn't it a luxury to be studying these great ancient or early modern thinkers, or is it an essential part of their training?
It's not a luxury. You really have to ask yourself, on what basis do you come in to a position of authority and make decisions that are going to affect a lot of people's lives? What is your intellectual background to do that? And it goes back also to the discussion that we had about chaos theory. If you think that the world is a chaotic place and that your best guide to dealing with a chaotic environment is pattern matching, is to be able to recognize patterns and think about similar patterns that you've seen before and how things have played out, if you have your lifetime is far too short to acquire a set of direct experiences that will give you enough of the patterns of history and of human nature to be able to draw on. So by reading the great masters, which is another way of saying gaining other people's experiences vicariously and reflecting on them objectively, which of course you can never fully reflect objectively on your own experiences, you can cushion yourself, you can give yourself that a serious basis to draw on. And I think this is sometimes one of the reasons why we have, for example, a lot of tension in the security community between area specialists and national security thinkers. And there are a variety of reasons for that. But one is that the area specialist who develops learning only about his or her area and who really immerses himself or herself fully in the Arab world, but doesn't really read any of the literature relating to the Western tradition or relating to Western history, can become very blinded by the perceptual lens created by the focus of that area of study. And you get, and I think we've all seen this, you get a tremendous amount of groupthink in a lot of area studies programs where we all sort of agree on how we feel about Arabs and the prospect for democracy among Arabs and so forth. And then that becomes a blinder and a lens. So I think even for people, although I enormously value the area studies experience, having gotten my degree in that, and I think it's incredibly important to understand another culture fully, to speak another language well, and really to be read into that as an experience, to know what it's like. I think it's also important to balance that with a more rounded humanistic education so that you're not trapped in that prism.
So you spent a great deal of time studying Russian military history. So why Russian military history? In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, did it seem so relevant then? And does it seem so relevant now? So why this area?
Well, cut me some slack because
you have as much slack as you want.
So I was, started studying Russian Soviet studies in 1987. And it wasn't quite so apparent then that the Cold War would be over within a couple of years and that I would graduate with a degree in Russian and East European studies in 1991.
The Soviets were so afraid of you.
They
just shut it down
before I even could get my degree.
Hopeless.
Absolutely, they were terrified. So I graduated in 1991 with this, sort of useless degree, which by then already, in an unusual display of alacrity by a university, I might add, by the time I graduated, it had become the degree in Russian studies as opposed to Soviet studies, and that was pretty astonishing to me. But I then doubled down on it and went and got my PhD in 19th century Russian history. I had no thought or desire that I was going to pursue a career in national security or foreign policy. I actually went to Yale thinking I was going to be a physics major, and the physics department talked me out of that. And while they were doing that, I was having a marvelous time at the hands of an incredibly gifted teacher by the name of Firuz Kazemzadeh, who was our Russian, sort of modern Russian history professor at Yale for a long time. And I realized that I was doing the wrong thing with physics and that I really should do something that I loved. I loved Russian culture, so I studied it. And I thought I was going to have an academic career. And I was a little bit conned by my dad on the subject of what an academic career actually would be, because then I got a job at West Point and discovered that, actually it's not so much of an easy thing to do. It's actually quite a lot of work in some environments, and used to make fun of my dad quite a lot for that. So
what was it like teaching at West Point?
It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing, and it was life transforming in so many ways. The opportunity to interact with students of that character was really an incredible experience. It's interesting, having gone to Yale, Kim taught at Yale briefly. I was a TA at Yale. I know what Yale students are like, and spent 10 years teaching at West Point. The top 5, maybe 10% of a Yale class you won't see at West Point. The bottom maybe 20% of a class at West Point you won't find at Yale. In the middle, there's an enormous amount of overlap. The sort of the quality level is really pretty comparable on the whole, outside of the extremes. The difference is that whereas you will run into many a brilliant Yalie who is prepared to give your course about 10% of his effort, you will deal with a large number of less brilliant cadets who are prepared to try to give your course 80 or 90 or 100% effort. And I have to tell you, as between dealing with brilliant students who are dialing it in and less brilliant students who are totally committed, I'll take the less brilliant students every time. And dealing with these kids was just, these are kids, your West Point cadets average 4.5 hours of sleep a night for 4 years. We put them through such an incredibly demanding program. They take 6 courses a term. And in addition to that, they have an enormous physical education component that they have to go through and a military education component that they have to go through. And we actually fail people. This is the astonishing thing. I'm glad you have this on camera because otherwise people may not believe this. Our grade ranges actually ran from A to F. And in the core courses when I taught, the average was regularly 80. And it's even more remarkable to think about that when you realize that every time we failed a cadet in a course, any course, the cadet went before the academic board to be considered for separation from the academy. So big stakes, but we failed cadets every term, and we separated cadets for failure on a regular basis. Because the other thing about it, and the amazing thing was, everybody there understood. We were training people who, as soon as they graduated, they were going to go to a brief training program, and then they were going to become platoon leaders, and they were going to have the lives of soldiers in their hands. And so the time to be hard on them was now in college, and not go easy on them now and let them learn on the job while people's lives depended on it. That made it an incredible experience.
So what was the path that led you from being a professor at West Point to being at a think tank in Washington? Was this always the grand plan?
No, I really thought, when I graduated with a PhD, I really thought I was going to be a professor. And I really wanted to be a professor. I got a job at West Point. I was thrilled. I was there for 10 years. It's very tough on the faculty. It's extremely demanding. And candidly, the academy, which the notion of really fully civilian faculty was a relative novelty. We'd only had that for a couple of years by the time I went. The academy hadn't fully figured out how to balance that. And I sort of hit a wall. I sort of hit a point at which I felt not only that I was not going to be able to grow, but I just became very frustrated that I felt like I couldn't give my best to the cadets anymore. And so I started looking around for other opportunities and discovered that I was absolutely not hireable in academia. Because not only was I a military historian, which qualified me for easily 2 jobs a year, but that I was actually an operational military historian and not a historian of women in war or culture in war or war and various other things and so forth, which disqualified me for those 2 jobs. And furthermore, that most academics who saw a transcript or resume come across their desk that had U.S. Military Academy on it immediately flipped it into the trash can. So, that's my explanation. Maybe that I was just a lousy professor and bad academic, but that's my story and I'm sticking with it. So that left me with not a lot of options. I started looking around. I had been writing about policy matters pretty much since I got to West Point, and I had become very committed to, or very concerned about the Iraq War, because I had a lot of friends who were serving there. I had students who were deploying there. I had, this was something that was of immediate personal concern. And so when Danny Pletka and Chris Demuth made the mistake of offering me a position at AEI, I leapt at it.
So you're widely credited as being one of the real architects of the surge change of strategy in the Iraq War. Can you just walk us through what happened? Meaning, as in itself, but also as a kind of case study about how serious policy analysis does occasionally really impact actual policy on the ground.
No, I can't, because I can give you my perspective on it. And what's been really fascinating to me in part about the surge discussion is listening to everybody give their story and realizing that I don't know what happened. And until and unless all the archives are open and all of the documents are released, and I spend a few years as a historian stepping outside of myself, I won't understand, because I saw a little sliver of it. And so to this day, I make no claim about what my role was, because I don't know what my role was. That having been said, basically what happened was I had been writing about Iraq, and we had been trying to inject some greater realism into the discussion about military options in Iraq, because it was a huge matter of huge frustration that people were very comfortable in 2005 and 2006, waving, doing what we call at West Point, big hand, little map, favorite cadet activity. Where's the enemy? Well, the enemy's here, and we're here, so we need to go there. You say, okay, that's great. I don't know how to cut orders that say that, but okay. So we there were a number of us, and some were in uniform, some were out of uniform, friends and other people in policy. We said, look, I mean, this isn't rocket science. We know how to do this. We know how to do military planning. We know how to gather intelligence. We know how to do threat estimates. We know how to do what's called in the military troop-to-task analysis. That is to say, figuring out for each thing that needs to be done on the battlefield, how many guys are necessary to do it. We can do this, and we don't have to deal with people who are saying, the epitome of this for me was Tom Ricks at one point, challenging me, and as I was presenting a suggestion for increasing our troop levels, said, well, the counterinsurgency manual says that you need one counterinsurgent for every 20 insurgents, for every 20 population. That means we need 500,000 troops in Iraq, and that's just ridiculous. So what you're proposing is ridiculous. I said, right. Okay, well, the thing is, we don't actually need 1 to 20 over the entire country because the insurgency is only in certain parts of it. But it made us realize, okay, the only way we're going to get through to people is if we actually do this. And this is honestly one of the most important lessons that I've learned. If you are not prepared to get your hands dirty and sit down and do menial labor at whatever stage of life you are at, and learn not to ask questions like, shouldn't somebody else be doing this? Unless you're a supremely gifted and fortunate individual, you're not going to make much of an impact. Because that's what we ultimately did. We said, okay, fine, we're going to get together a bunch of people. We've got PhDs, we've got senior people, we've got general officers, we've got various different people, ultimately crowding around a map, reading media reports, gathering stuff together, putting icons on the map, looking at Google Earth pictures, and saying, okay, boys, how would you do this? And then that's what we ultimately did. We conducted a 4-day planning exercise in December of 2006. And that was kind of an amazing thing, because I didn't expect to come up with an acceptable answer. We were just going to come up with a recommendation. And I didn't know exactly what it would be. And I had no idea whether it would be feasible or not. So there was actually a moment in that exercise that I remember very vividly, as we had gone through, laid out what we thought the threat was, and then laid out what we thought all the troop-to-task requirements were, and then tallied all of that up and said, well, how many additional forces do we think are going to be necessary? And we came to the answer, we think it's 6 brigades, 6 Army brigades, and 1 or 2 Marine regiments. And we went back and we looked at our estimates of what could the U.S. military provide. I'm sorry, it was 5 Army brigades. Did I say 6? It was 5. What could the U.S. military provide? And we'd gone through it and said, well, if we go to 15-month deployments, we could get 5 brigades. And I said, okay, that's unlikely. So we went back and did the calculations another way. I said, okay, let's forget about this methodology. Let's try another methodology on this. And we came up with the same number. And I just sort of walked away in a kind of stunned sensation. Oh my God, I mean, there's actually a real option here that you can put some rigor behind, and it's actually sort of feasible. And that was amazing and scary. And so we put that together, and we discovered that Jack Keane, who was participating in this exercise, was going to be going in with a bunch of other retired generals to brief President Bush on the Monday after this exercise. We put together the 55-slide PowerPoint deck laying all of this stuff out. And we actually had the opportunity to brief Vice President Cheney, and Jack brought it in to brief the president, or at least hand the president in the course of that conversation. And then later that week, we had the opportunity to brief Steve Hadley and the National Security staff. And then I don't know. Then my direct knowledge of it basically fades out. Eric has told the story of how he handed it to Gates. I don't know. What I do know now, I didn't know at the time, was that Ray Odierno, as the incoming Corps commander, was working on his own estimates and coming to pretty much the same conclusion. And Dave Petraeus was also, whom I had not met at the time, doing the same thing. And all of these estimates were actually converging, which was interesting. And then all of these people started to converge. And and then President Bush did something that I think I would have bet any amount of money that he wouldn't have done. The decision to do the surge was one of the most courageous decisions a president has made in our time. If I recall correctly, support for the war effort and for the idea of a surge was about 19% when he made that call. He'd just lost both houses of Congress, gotten shellacked, was hated by his own party, had no support in Congress for doing this, had his senior commanders adamantly opposed the idea and thought that it, not just out of stubbornness, but they really thought it was wrong. Maliki didn't want to do it. But he became persuaded that this was the only hope of success. And he said, I don't want to lose this war. I think this is my only chance. I'm going to do this. It was an amazing decision. Would have bet any amount of money you want against any president making that call.
So this is, I guess, to begin to get us into some of the current moment, but as you look back from where we stand now, did it work? And how has it unfolded since then in Iraq and more broadly in the Middle East?
So when we put the strategy together, we were very clear on what we thought its intended purpose was and what we thought would be required afterwards. What we saw at the time was the primitive mobilization of communities in Iraq for a full-scale communal civil war. And that was actually the thing that was panicking us. Shia militias were very bad. We were very upset about that. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was very bad. We were very upset about that. The Sunni the Ba'athist resistance was bad. But what we started to see was actual local communities in Baghdad that were not affiliated with or controlled by any of these things taking up arms and attacking their neighbors. So in other words, we started to see the emergence of a full-up Hobbesian state of nature along sectarian lines in Baghdad. And our feeling was, if that gets going, not only is there no hope whatsoever for Iraq, but it will spread in the region. And it will engulf the region in sectarian war. And so we have to stop that. We have to stop that. So that was the focus. How do we stop that sectarian war? Now, in the course of that, we also have to set conditions for defeating Al-Qaeda in Iraq. You have to set conditions for defeating and demobilizing the Shia militias, and so forth, all with the expectation that only by doing that could you create space for an Iraqi political process to work. We thought that it would take, I think our estimates were 18 to 24 months at surge levels to be able to stabilize the situation and allow the basic elements of an Iraqi political structure to begin to work. And then we expected that there would be the requirement for subsequent operations over time. We were surprised by how rapidly the security situation improved. We anticipated that it would be much slower than it was. And we were surprised at how rapidly the political situation evolved. We also anticipated that that would be much slower and more difficult. So we went from a situation in 2006 where we were watching people mobilize for a full-up communal civil war to a situation in 2010 where we have another election, we have enormous turnout and participation, we have Maliki actually lose the election even though he subsequently retained power, and we supported that, or that is to say the Obama administration supported that, in my view, mistakenly. But we were on a trajectory in Iraq. Iraq was on a trajectory to stabilize and to develop a political system that had a chance of being inclusive and of becoming stable. And then we pulled our forces out, which had a number of extremely baleful consequences. One was that the next day, Maliki ordered the arrest of Tariq al-Hashimi, his Sunni vice president, on charges of conspiracy and terrorism and other things, but it was a nakedly political sectarian move of the sort that he would have been much less comfortable making while we were there. And that had always been one of the things that we had been doing. Maliki has always been a sectarian bastard. And he has always been a sectarian actor. And one of the things that General Petraeus and Odierno and Austin spent a huge amount of their time was controlling him and being a more positive influence on him, using positive and negative levers of coercion, shall we say. When that was removed, you got naked sectarian actor with no restraint. And he started going down that road. But the other thing is, we had not built the Iraqi security forces to operate on their own. We had built them to operate supported by our enablers, by our air, by our intelligence assets, by our communications to some extent, by some of our weaponry, by some of our advisors. We had not designed a force to stand on its own. And so when we pulled out, on the one hand, Maliki put the gas back on the sectarian struggle, which stayed peaceful for a remarkably long time. But on the other hand, the ISF found itself propelled into a fight that it hadn't signed up for. And so we see the ISF start to deteriorate in quality over time, and that accelerates the worse the situation gets. And we saw the sectarian violence come to the fore, not violence, the sectarian tension come to the fore as Maliki continued to act against his Sunni rivals. And here again, and I apologize for rambling, but one of the things that I most blame the Obama administration for, they get virtually no blame for. It has nothing to do with troop decisions. It has to do with the way we handled the aftermath of the election in Iraq in 2010 and the degree to which we had, to this point, steadfastly worked to support Maliki, to rush the Iraqis through a government formation process, and ultimately to fragment the Sunni political elite, in large part, I think at the time, because we wanted Maliki to win quickly so that we could start negotiating status of forces agreement with him. And so there was this incredible pressure that we put the Iraqis under to form a government and then to form it around Maliki because we thought we could deal with him, which I think was a huge mistake. And then, of course, we don't get the status of forces agreement. And then, things start to go badly. So that, I would say, is the long trajectory that we've been. So did the surge work? Yes, the surge accomplished all of the objectives that we had set for it and more. But it was never intended to be a permanent, forever solution to the problem. It was a stage in a war. And the subsequent stage was handled okay, not as I would have liked. And the stage after that was handled exactly the opposite to the way that I think it needed to be handled.
So I want to come back to the current moment and your thinking about it. But before we talk a little bit about how you see it, I'd like to maybe understand more how you work, meaning you're involved in two important think tank projects, the Critical Threats Project at AEI and the Institute for the Study of War, which your wife, Kim Kagan, runs. So what do these two projects do? How are they structured? How are they staffed? What are their products? What are their aims? How does this all work?
So Kim established ISW in 2007 in a very entrepreneurial way. I don't recommend this approach. Trying to establish a nonprofit with no money and no funders is not a great way to go. But she made a go of it, and she was consciously establishing a new model for think tanks. Basically, it was meant to be something that was a think tank, but that was also basically an open source intelligence center. So by open source intelligence, I mean intelligence using openly available information, not classified information, but applying to it the rigor and standards and tradecraft and approach the intelligence community uses. And so we, and then I set up Critical Threats Project at AEI shortly thereafter to do the same thing. And we've been trying to create a new model. And the model is that it's not just an open source intelligence center because the purpose of that is just to provide information and analysis. We also provide policy recommendations because we think that's important. You have to keep those two things tied together. So we have very young teams. Most of our analysts, I have 6 full-time employees. Kim has, I think, about 15. And then we have a proliferation of interns. That's the collective noun, by the way, for interns. It's a proliferation of interns. I have, at any given moment, we have between 20 and 40 interns running around, who do most of the work and have most of the insight, and they're amazing kids. And we try to hire from that pool. We train them in intelligence tradecraft. We train them in collecting information. We train them in analysis. We teach them how to write. Unfortunately, most of them are college graduates and therefore don't know how to write very well. So we work on remedying those deficiencies. And we train them how to think, and we train them how to think as analysts, and we train them how to think as decision makers and as people who are providing support to decision makers. And so we produce a range of products, from daily tracking products that are basically, this is what happened in the world today, which, by the way, make incredibly depressing reading at the moment, to long papers of the 30, 40, 50-page variety going into a lot of detail and providing a lot of context, to policy recommendations, usually in the form of PowerPoint decks, because if you want to get recommendations to most policymakers, it needs to be in PowerPoint, that take the analysis and put it against real-world problems, and make recommendations and then get feedback.
So what are the most critical threats, and how critical are they, and what should we be doing about them?
Well, we have, I have a hierarchy of problems. The top of them is our enemies, people who are actively working, people in groups that are actively working to attack us. Below that are threats, are people who are not actively working to kill us, but are thinking hard about it and trying to get themselves ready. And below that, I would put challenges, where it's not so much thinking about how to hurt us, but doing things that are creating problems for the United States one way or another. And theoretically below that, we could talk about opportunities, but candidly, we don't have the resources to get much below threats or even deal with all the threats that there are, because unfortunately we have enemies. And we have Al-Qaeda movements and Al-Qaeda affiliates around the world. And there are a lot of people who wake up every day who ask themselves, what can I do today to improve my ability to kill Americans? And then try to implement that. So that's when someone is actually actively trying to kill you, then that should focus your attention. It's shocking to me the degree to which it doesn't seem to focus the attention of many decision makers in this country. But that's our sort of top priority. Iran is a very close second. Iran is also an enemy. Iran has been killing Americans since, well, 1979, and has continued to take every opportunity that it seems reasonable to them to take to improve their ability to kill Americans, and are quite willing and eager to do so. That makes them an enemy. Now, it doesn't follow that I think we should attack them necessarily. It doesn't follow that any specific policy recommendation comes out of that. But I think if you don't start by recognizing that that's the relationship you have, you end up running the risk of getting very confused. Then we also have major threats like Russia, which has become a threat once again because Russian forces and paramilitaries are invading the territory of a state to which the United States gave something very close to a security guarantee, which everyone has conveniently forgotten about, and which is also stoking a sectarian war on Europe for the first time since about the 18th century, in a way that is very distressing. So that's a major threat, or enemy threat, as you wish. China, of course.
So let's look at a couple of these a little more carefully. Iraq. What's going on in Iraq right now? Iraq/Syria. What's your analysis of it? What should America be doing?
So the rebellion, the problems in Iraq and Syria both arose in parallel to a considerable extent, and they began as relatively peaceful protests on the part of mainly Sunni, although in Syria it was initially mixed, opponents of the current regime, Maliki in Iraq and Assad in Syria. Maliki refrained, and the opposition refrained from going violent for quite a long time. Syrian opposition, Syrian regime and Syrian opposition went violent pretty quickly, which was very polarizing in both places. The United States ponderously did nothing. The rest of the world ponderously did nothing while all of this went on. That was not true of all of our other partners. The Iranians very quickly recognized a threat to Assad, who was their critical proxy in the region, began sending him resources and then advisors of various different levels, and then ultimately encouraged, perhaps ordered, Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, to invade Syria, which they did, marking, I think, the first time Hezbollah has ever invaded another country or used military force outside its borders in a massive way, which has gone, received relatively little attention as a major inflection point in history. And all of that had the effect of throwing gasoline on the fire of sectarian warfare in Syria, which was also connected to the sectarian strife in Iraq. The Sunni tribes straddle the border. The border is meaningless in a human terrain sense and so forth. And of course, the radical group in Syria that was most dangerous was the artist formerly known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which Bashar al-Assad had allowed to set up shop, encouraged to set up shop in Syria while we were in Iraq, and which came back to bite him rather badly. So you had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, now renamed the Islamic State of Iraq, rebuilding itself, and still we did nothing. And then we had the Red Line. And that was a calamity in so many ways, it's hard to count them all. But in terms of the politics, in terms of not the politics, but in terms of the balance of the situation in Syria, the president basically did the moral equivalent of calling for a hit and run, and then he didn't swing. So when he announced the Red Line and when it seemed that strikes were going to be imminent, the moderate opposition in Syria positioned itself to conduct attacks to take advantage of the strike. And when the president then didn't swing, they broke for second anyway, because he didn't tell them, and Assad picked them off. So to come out of the baseball metaphor, they were poised for an attack. We did nothing. Assad waited a beat to see that we were not going to do anything, and then he crushed them. And the effect of that was to discredit the moderate opposition within Syria in a very fundamental way. And it empowered the radical groups that had been there already, including Jabhat al-Nusra and ISI, who had been saying all along, what are you trusting the Americans, this is going to happen, we're the only savior, and so forth. So that decision radicalized the Sunni opposition within Syria in a very fundamental way. And then, of course, it meant that we were going to take no action whatsoever, while ISI, and then it rebranded itself ISIS, took full control of the Syrian province of Raqqa and began governing it as a state, from which they were able to develop the political and military capabilities to conduct what was basically a mechanized assault on Mosul a couple of weeks ago, which, when you take a look at the pictures, it's really quite something. These guys had a column of vehicles in Northern Ireland that we would have called them technicals. They were basically, pickup trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the back. But they formed, there's a picture of these guys in these things, forming a skirmish line, having at ISF troops in what was basically conventional combat. Pretty much 2 full Iraqi divisions dissolved, disintegrated on the battlefield. The other 2 that had been in the north fell back in pieces and are scrambling. So they shattered the Iraqi army in the north. And then they started pushing on Baghdad, and the Iranians reacted in Iraq the same way that they had reacted in Syria, only more so. Qasem Soleimani went to Baghdad. We have reports from people on the ground that he actually did not initially meet with Maliki or any of the political leaders, but immediately went to the front line and started giving orders and started arranging the defense of Baghdad. The Iranians have announced what their defensive position is. They will defend the shrines in Samarra, Qadamiyya, Karbala, and Najaf. And they have said that they want to create an exclusion zone from the Iranian border that runs about 100 kilometers into Iraq. And they've deployed Quds forces, and they've deployed some IRGC special forces elements, and a number of other things. And even that's not the worst problem. The worst problem is that, as I think we talked about before, Grand Ayatollah Sistani issued what has been taken to be a fatwa, even though it wasn't, calling on Shia to mobilize against the Takfiris which has led to the mobilization of tens of thousands of Iraqi Shia to form militias. And now we have pictures of 8-year-old boys walking around Baghdad with AK-47s and pistols as part of the Shia militia. So the sectarian war is game on. The Iranians are in. The Al-Qaeda is in. I think it will not be very long before the Saudis and the other Sunni states that have a big dog in that fight are in. And we're sending 300 advisors. That's the basic situation.
What should we be doing?
We need to get back onto the ground to engage with the Sunni. The biggest danger the biggest danger in many respects is complete inaction. But given that we're going to take action, the second biggest danger is that we appear to be taking the side of Maliki, the Iranians, and the Shia. And of course, all this discussion about how maybe the Iranians are actually our ally in this didn't help very much. So what we seem to be doing is to be parceling out these advisors to Iraqi brigades and divisions and operational commands to assist with targeting. That is going to make us look like we have taken Maliki's side and the Iranian side. What we need to do is to deploy significant numbers of special forces into the Sunni areas, reestablish contact with the Sunni tribes that we'd fought alongside against these guys before, and have them tell us who the ISIS guys are that we actually should target and who are the people who are reconcilable, and start trying to peel this thing apart again, while at the same time diffusing the ISIS attack. And we have to operate in Syria, because we've got a cancer that's on both sides of the border. So if we go after the tumors that are in Iraq, but we leave the massive tumor that's in Syria, it isn't going to work. So we need to have a counter-ISIS strategy. But the objective also has to be to prevent the Iranians from establishing permanent military bases in Iraq. And I would tell you that right now I think that's a very serious danger. So I'm back to surge kind of odds of success here, because when we recommended the surge strategy, I gave it about a 1 in 5 chance of working. This one might be lower. But I think the course that we're on, if we do nothing, is so close to 100% certainty, incredibly bad.
Bad how? How
bad
is it
in the
bad
sense
for
that
America?
It's bad for America in the sense that the likeliest outcome, if the current course doesn't change, is that you have a sort of institutionalized sectarian war that runs along the fault line in Iraq from the border in Diyala province through Baghdad down to Karbala, with attacks going into the depths of that both ways, with Iranian military forces permanently in Iraq, and with ISIS in control of Mosul and in control of Raqqa province in Syria and a lot of the territory in between, running a state and building its army. They will attack us. That is their ultimate intent. And whether or not ISIS directly attacks us, although I think that they would, they will provide the training ground and the breeding ground for a flow of foreign fighters, which we're already seeing, that's in the thousands, who come through, get their jihad on for a little while, get trained, and then go back, and that's now including Americans. So we are looking at a threat to the homeland. And the notion that the administration keeps putting out, that basically the time to deal with the threat to the homeland is when they actually attack the homeland, seems insane to me. Because we need to keep in mind that while we're letting all of this go on, we're doing everything in our power to dismantle our intelligence capabilities on the grounds that because Rand Paul is worried about getting hit by a drone in a coffee shop. And so we're blinding ourselves. We're making it so that we're much more likely to miss the attack, go back to 9/11 kind of mistakes, and create opportunities just as we're allowing these guys to get ready to take swings at us. So the strategy we're engaged in right now is completely nonsensical.
But President Obama's a smart man. He's surrounded by policy analysts like you. Why do they seem to see it so differently? Do they have a different theory that is compelling?
They have been putting out a different description of the al-Qaeda threat. And their description of it publicly has been very focused on distinguishing groups that have the active stated intent to attack the United States from groups that don't. And their thesis has been that whereas we should go after the groups that are trying to attack us, others are a local problem and we need to avoid getting engaged. And as ISIS was seizing Mosul, Director of Central Intelligence John Brennan was at Georgetown explaining that the al-Qaeda movement has become atomized and fractured. Okay, I don't actually agree with that assessment, but even if you do agree with that assessment, it might be worth noting that one of the atoms was taking a city of 2 million people in Iraq. But so we have a different assessment of the situation. I won't speculate as to other reasons why they might be doing what they're doing.
So let's speak for a minute about Russia. What's going on in Russia, with Russia? How should America see and think about that? And to what extent does your training in Russian military history actually inform how you think about it?
Unfortunately, it's comes in quite handy in a couple of ways. First of all, because Vladimir Putin, or as I like to call him now, Tsar Vladimir. We haven't had a Tsar named Vladimir for a long time.
I knew eventually I'd get you into your Russian accent.
Absolutely. Tsar Vladimir is a KGB thug to begin with. He was a colonel in the KGB, and which leads to interesting dynamics as he now commands the people who were his superiors and doesn't forget that for a minute, and neither do they. But he was a KGB thug, and he thinks very much like a KGB thug. So all the time that I invested into understanding how KGB thugs think comes in pretty handy when looking at it. But he also now fancies himself a historian and a theorist and various other things, and so he's proclaiming, in addition, of course, to fancying himself the world's handsomest, strongest man. Napoleon complex, anyone? So he talks about, Russia's great destiny, and he talks about Ivan the Terrible, and he talks about Stalin wistfully. And he has an image that he articulates about the importance of the Orthodox Church, which tells you that he wasn't that committed a KGB thug to begin with, which I think is true. I think he was one of the more opportunistic guys who were involved in that. And that's what I mean when I talk about a sectarian conflict. One of the things that's interesting, it hasn't gotten a lot of reporting, is that the degree to which he's co-opted the Orthodox Church and the degree to which that has created a fifth column in Ukraine is actually enormous. Wherever there is an Orthodox Church in Ukraine, pretty much, you have a base for Russian activity. And they operate very much in the way that we have seen mosques used in combat zones. They're treated as places of sanctuary, but they're used for stockpiling weapons. They're used for providing sanctuary selectively to one side or the other. And they're used sometimes as command and control nodes. So you have an Orthodox versus Catholic versus Uniate Catholic fight going on in Ukraine that is self-consciously religious on Putin's part. And the really weird and scary thing is the degree to which I hear very similar kinds of ideological gobbledygook coming out of the mouths of younger people in Russia. This is hitting a chord. This narrative that they've created, which is as ridiculous as Hitler's, as infinitely less sophisticated and well-articulated than Lenin's, is nevertheless hitting a chord with Russians who, like the Germans after the First World War, feel betrayed, feel stabbed in the back, feel humiliated at the hands of the West, remember that they were a superpower, want to be a superpower again, all of that kind of stuff. And he's feeding off of that for now. So so unfortunately, knowing something about Russian history is helpful because it helps me pick out the specific examples he's pointing to and say, that's what he's going for. Okay.
So what's his strategy and what should our strategy be?
He doesn't really have a strategy. He has a goal. And I think his goal is the reunification of the Russian people, which means the reunification of the control of the territories of the former Soviet Union and Finland, by the way, which used to be part of the Russian Empire, under his dominion. But he's very opportunistic about how he will pursue that goal, and he's patient. He thinks he has time. I think he plans to live forever. And he doesn't seem to be in a rush. So he takes advantage of opportunities as they're presented, which makes him seem unpredictable. He isn't really. The truth of the matter is, if you see things from his perspective and you see what looks like an opportunity for him, you could be pretty sure that he will try to take advantage of it. He also sees us as the enemy. And he's absolutely clear about this, and his people are absolutely clear about this. He says, we are behind the Ukrainian resistance, which is true to some limited extent. And we are causing all of these troubles, and we've deprived Russia of her rightful place in the world and all this kind of stuff. So we have very much of an enemy language on one side of this. I guess the reset didn't last. But we don't like to think about things that way. What should we be doing? We need to prevent him from taking Ukraine. There are some pretty core U.S. national security interests involved in preventing him from doing that. For one thing, you have the issue of energy monopoly on our allies. That's kind of a big deal. For another thing, you have the matter that we actually did give Ukraine something of a security guarantee jointly with Russia in 1994 in exchange for having Ukraine give up the nuclear weapons that were left on its territory when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so if you are remotely interested in the issue of nuclear nonproliferation, the question of whether we live up to that guarantee or not is going to weigh heavily in the minds of any future state that we ask either to give up or not to acquire nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee. So that's a matter of deep concern. And then, of course, we have the problem that I am convinced that he doesn't intend to stop with Ukraine. And the next step is probably either Moldova or Latvia. And wait a minute, Latvia is a NATO member. So our problem is that we're now very, very close to having this conflict right up against an Article 5 commitment that we have to defend the Baltic states. And we may come all the way around to the question of, are we prepared to defend NATO members or not? I would submit that it's in our interest not to have that fight over Latvia. It would be better to not lose Ukraine and try to deter further adventurism on his part.
As you think about the security situation of, the world in general and the security situation of America in particular, what's your realistic optimism about the next 5 years, and what's your realistic pessimism about the next 5 years?
The problem that I have is that I try to sense the inertia in the system, the different elements of inertia in the system, to assess how I think things are going to go. And I ask myself the question, I see a lot of things that are driving toward destabilization, toward things that harm American interests and the interests of our allies, and toward an erosion of the international order. And I see very few things, and those very weak, actually pushing in the other direction. So there will be a certain extent, probably, to which the forces of disorder and antagonism will grind down just through natural frictions of their own. But I don't see anything that is pushing strongly in the direction of stopping them, let alone reversing that. So I don't do optimism and pessimism, but I would say I expect things to get a lot worse over the next few years. And unless there's a major change in the attitudes and behavior of the United States and our allies, I think things will continue to be bad for a long time. Now, whether the bottom will drop out and we'll have, massive world war, whatever, it's less of a throwaway line than it used to be. I can imagine a circumstance where something like that happens, more than imagine. Or whether things sort of stabilize at a new normal that is much more violent and much more displeasing to the United States and much less in our interests, which strikes me as more likely.
You've laid out a whole series of very complicated threats that America faces, Israel faces, world order faces. What should we be doing to educate leaders to be able to handle those threats? What kind of investments in education, in institutions and knowledge of certain kinds should America as a nation, American universities, think tanks, whoever it is, be making so that the leaders who might emerge actually have the expertise, the judgment, the capacity of pattern recognition, the courage, whatever it takes to handle these threats?
Well, to begin with, I think we have to go back to the tenets of liberal education. And here I'll channel my father unabashedly and say that the kinds of education that he was advocating for throughout his career remain important and will remain important as long as the task is developing citizens for a free society. The study of history is absolutely vital. Re-separating history from social science would be a big step in the right direction. And by that I mean refocusing history on the study of the particulars rather than the grand sweeps of history, which is basically, as I've said elsewhere, Marxism in a modern form, masquerading as political science. We need to do that. But as I also said when talking with Eric Edelman, we really need to educate people in how war works and stuff. This is something that we used to do, and we've largely stopped doing. And the Institute for the Study of War, at Roger Hertog's suggestion and behest, has started to do. And I think it is something that's probably going to have to happen outside the academy, because I think the academy is so determinedly opposed to doing that at this point that it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to turn that around. Area studies are also critically important. We need to teach people foreign languages, starting with English. I can't tell you how horrifying it is. Any of you who are teachers and who have to deal with people coming out of our university system at this point, and looking at what passes for English, and it's not just that I'm an old style prig and I can't stand bad English. It's that bad writing reflects bad thinking, and when you don't write clearly, you're not thinking clearly, and that's one of the big problems that we have. And the Twitter revolution is very harmful. If you think in 140 characters of misspelled gobbledygook, then your odds of being able to develop complex, coherent thoughts and handle complex problems are very low. But you also need to be able to speak foreign languages and understand other people's, and this is something that we've always had a very hard time with. So, it's a massive undertaking. I think we are really not well positioned. I think, we talk to ourselves about our STEM problem, and we do have a STEM problem. But we don't talk enough about the problem that we have on the humanities side of this, which is also very significant and will prevent us from developing the generations of people who can deal with the problems that we now know they are going to face.
Fred, thanks.
Thanks.